Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Jeff Cook. Listeners, Jeff is the General Counsel for the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, where he leads USADA's legal and investigative staff, as well as the legal department's arbitration and legal cases. And he's joining us today to discuss his role in fighting doping in sport. So, Jeff, we're thrilled to welcome you here today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me, Marie. It's great to be here.
Well, Jeff, we're excited to have you with us, and I'd love to start off, if it's all right, for you to just walk through your responsibilities there as General Counsel for USADA, in case people aren't familiar with kind of what General Counsel does.
Absolutely. Happy to do that. My most basic function is to supervise cases and manage the legal department staff, so that would include both investigators and attorneys. I also take on special projects and assist the CEO on a variety of matters. And then I, of course, provide legal guidance to other departments and for the organization as a whole, whether that be managing the work of outside counsel or negotiating contracts.
Excellent. And you were promoted to USADA's General Counsel back in early 2021. So now that you've got a year under your belt, is there anything that has really surprised you about this role so far?
Well, I'd say the most surprising thing about the General Counsel role was the timing. I ended up stepping in, as you mentioned, at the early part of last year, and it was shortly before we were going to a 10-day hearing in a major case that we brought against Alberto Salazar and Dr. Jeffrey Brown. So the timing was the surprise because I ended up stepping in as lead counsel on that case, and we were successful in that appeal, upholding the 4-year bans of both individuals.
Oh, excellent. And I know before you started in clean sport, you were actually working for the U.S. Attorney's Office investigating and bringing to trial sex offense and human trafficking cases. So can you tell me and our listeners a little bit about your path and how you actually found your way into anti-doping and ultimately working for USADA?
So there's actually more overlap than you may think at first blush between the two. Both roles involved public service. In the current role at USADA, we're safeguarding the integrity of sport with respect to performance-enhancing drugs. Both roles involve investigations and following up on leads, evaluating evidence, and building cases. And then, of course, both roles involve written and oral advocacy. So there is quite a bit of overlap in terms of the skill set. And then I was just also very fortunate to have the opportunity to come to the great state of Colorado, where I really enjoy the outdoors and so much about the state.
Oh, wonderful. Now, were you an athlete yourself?
Growing up, I did run competitively, and I also raced mountain bikes, but that didn't go beyond high school. But I definitely had that as a foundation for my life and my childhood.
Phenomenal. And I understand Colorado's a great place for running outside, mountain biking, those sorts of things. So do you continue to engage in these activities?
Absolutely. It's the perfect state for all of that. So yeah, I really enjoy exploring the outdoors with my family and going camping and doing as much outdoor activity as I can.
And you mentioned there's some similarities, of course, between the work you'd been doing previously at the U.S. Attorney's Office and the work you do now. But what are maybe some of the biggest differences in how you approach anti-doping?
I'd say the biggest differences between the two is the role that science plays. Not that science didn't play a role in my sex offense cases that I had. It, of course, was a big component. But within the anti-doping context, it seems like almost every aspect of a case is related to the science. Many of our cases are initiated based off of a positive test, which, of course, comes from samples being analyzed at a lab. And then oftentimes the science also comes into play with, okay, well, how does that substance affect the physiology? And so the science just seems to permeate every aspect of a case within anti-doping. And in my previous role as a prosecutor, the science would have more of a defined or limited role within the case, although still important, just didn't permeate into every aspect of the case like it does within the anti-doping context.
Oh, that makes sense. So was there a steep learning curve for you then when you made that transition and sort of had to wrap your head around all the science?
Oh, absolutely. We have a great science team who is expert in explaining things to lay people and lawyers. So they have played a very important role. But yes, absolutely. When I first arrived, I had a brief due the first week I was here and definitely had to dig in and absorb both the new sets of rules and also the science. So yeah, it was definitely a steep learning curve.
Certainly. And you hinted that there are, of course, similarities. What are some of these similarities? And were there any that really surprised you between your previous work and your work now in anti-doping?
I think the most surprising thing to me was that I did not anticipate or expect that there would be overlap with the domestic violence issues that I encounter daily as a prosecutor. But there have been instances where the two worlds have come together and that same power dynamic is in play, but the outcome is doping as opposed to a violent crime.
Certainly. And I know anti-doping law can be quite complicated. You mentioned there's a lot of science involved and just a lot of nuance that I think people don't necessarily appreciate. So is there anything that you've found kind of in working in this area that people in the general public frequently misunderstand about the legal process involved in anti-doping?
Well, there are probably many things because the rules that the World Anti-Doping Agency writes, the anti-doping regulations, they get longer and more nuanced with each iteration. We, at USADA, we try to lay out the relevant rules for athletes when there's a case, or even with our education programs, we try to provide a general understanding of what the rules entail and what the responsibilities of athletes are within those rules. And we do our best to do that, but it is a lot to take in. Fortunately, in addition to the explanations and the education that USADA provides, athletes also have a really phenomenal resource with the Athlete Ombuds Office. And that office is led by Casey Wallace, and they offer another ear and another hand to athletes going through the process.
Certainly. And I think through your responses thus far, you've sort of hinted that your role there, kind of on the legal side at USADA, interfaces with the scientists, the educators, athletes. So can you talk a little bit about what it's like working with all these different stakeholders?
It's generally great. And we have a phenomenal team mentality, and we coordinate and meet regularly so that we're all on the same page in terms of what the new rules are. For example, a new set of rules came out just last year. And so there was a lot of consultation and discussion about how those would be implemented in the U.S. and making sure everyone was aware of those changes. And with science, there are always new issues being raised, and we're at the forefront of resolving those issues to the benefit of innocent athletes who may have tested positive from some innocent source. So that's really a critical part of what we do and what our science department does, is making sure that athletes who have inadvertently tested positive are not going to suffer a severe sanction and try not to have the process go for an extended period of time. So we're really trying to be proactive and diligent about determining what caused an athlete's positive test if it was an inadvertent source.
Certainly. And I know when it comes to legal matters, every country operates a little bit differently, but do you draw inspiration or do you collaborate with other national anti-doping organizations when you have some of these tough cases or tough issues that are difficult to sort through?
Certainly, a lot of the coordination happens both on the science side and on the investigation side. So it's not limited to the scientific issues, but our chief science officer is part of working groups that share information and collaborate on various trends that they are seeing, or different sources of, if it's an innocuous source, different innocuous sources that may be leading to positive tests. For example, USADA was the first entity to discover that an ingredient in a sunscreen that was actually not prohibited would be converted within the body to a metabolite that was shared with a prohibited substance. And so they were being identified as having ingested a prohibited substance when in fact it was coming from a completely permissible source. So that's another example of how through our diligent efforts, we're able to prevent innocent athletes from being caught up in the anti-doping system.
Certainly, that's very interesting. And I know as General Counsel, you're obviously in charge of these legal matters for USADA. But as we were hinting here, you're in charge of this investigation as well, which has a really important role. So can you tell us a little bit more about this investigation division, what it does, who works there, and how you balance these two roles?
Well, each day is different, but we do have exciting things happening on the investigations front with the passage of the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act. That law criminalizes athlete support personnel or other people from conspiring to commit fraud through doping athletes at major events. And so that is a new frontier where sanctioning the athletes is still within USADA's purview, but these other individuals who might otherwise fall outside of the rules are now brought in under this law that criminalizes that activity. So it's a great opportunity to partner with law enforcement and other investigatory entities around the world to really curb doping activities and ensure that the playing field is level and that the competition is fair, which is what we all value and what we all want. And then in terms of our investigators, I'm really privileged to work with some of the most phenomenal investigators I've ever had a chance to work with. They have decades of experience and are really the cream of the crop in terms of their passion for the mission and the respect that they show athletes and all those with whom they interact.
Certainly. And I'm glad you brought up the Rodchenko Anti-Doping Act. I think this is critical now, finally being able to have punitive measures for people who are sort of supporting doping efforts. And I'm curious, from an investigations perspective, when it's an athlete potentially doping, there are certain types of evidence you can look for, samples, you can kind of get testimony from teammates, colleagues, things like that. Is the nature of the evidence different, or maybe how you go about collecting that evidence different when you're talking about these other individuals, whether it's coaches or other support personnel?
I don't think anything is different with respect to cases under the Rodchenko Anti-Doping Act. These cases are still going to rely on brave, courageous whistleblowers who are willing to stand up and tell the truth. So that's why it's really important. We have a tip line for whistleblowers, and we've now extended that to being able to text in tips anonymously, because we want to do everything we can to make it as easy as possible and reduce the amount of fear as best we can by allowing individuals to report completely anonymously if they want. And they can stay anonymous, and we'll honor that and protect their identity. And so we want to make sure that individuals feel comfortable bringing information to us, because we will certainly follow up on that information to the best of our abilities and have a proven track record of doing so, culminating in successful anti-doping cases. And certainly with the involvement of law enforcement, they have abilities that USADA does not have. And so if they share that information with us, then we can use that to follow up and build cases as well.
Oh, certainly. And it sounds like you've got your sort of work cut out for you on the investigative side. A lot of cool things going on there at USADA. So how do you balance your roles as General Counsel with all this investigative work going on?
The balance comes day by day. If there's an investigation going on that needs my attention, I will devote as much attention to it as necessary to make sure that we're on the right path, that the relationships are strong with the whistleblowers, with law enforcement. And like I said, having a great team of investigators, I don't have to worry about that very much. But certainly from keeping tabs on it and making sure things are going in the right direction, I'm certainly involved in that way. But I often am able to allow the investigators to just do their work as they know best and save my time for reviewing the work and ultimately making decisions on how cases will proceed.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And I know you worked on a wide variety of cases there at USADA. We mentioned specifically the Salazar and Brown example, I think was a fascinating case. But what kind of cases interest you the most in the work that you do?
Well, as I alluded to a little earlier, I think some of our most impactful cases have come from whistleblowers. And those cases are what we refer to as non-analytical cases. These are cases that are not based off of a positive test. And so they require the involvement of whistleblowers. They require building relationships of trust with those whistleblowers to really allow them a platform to relay their inspiring testimonials and what they have seen and how that has impacted them. So that is the most rewarding aspect of the cases for me, is having whistleblowers feel empowered through this process and see real results that positively impact their sport.
Certainly. And I know these whistleblower cases can be quite delicate. What are some of the biggest challenges that you face in kind of getting all of the information and getting results from them?
The biggest challenge is fear. I think there's fear of the unknown, which is the process that many people are unfamiliar with. And so being able to explain what it's going to look like and what their involvement will look like. The other fear is from the individuals that they're making allegations against, fear of retaliation, fear of retribution. And we've seen that play out back with the allegations against Lance Armstrong, and the things that were said to and about people who were coming forward was very intimidating. And similarly with the Alberto Salazar and Dr. Brown cases, we faced challenges with whistleblowers feeling afraid for their careers, for their safety, So those are the biggest challenges with these types of cases, but we have a lot of experience in dealing with those, and we've been very successful in building trust and a feeling of security for those individuals to come forward and bravely share what they've seen and heard.
Definitely. And I think the system has come a really long way in terms of making it easier for them to remain anonymous, making it easier for people to share information and tips. So you're working hard to address this big challenge in anti-doping. But I guess, Jeff, if you have to think forward, what do you see as the next big challenge for anti-doping law to really hash out?
I think there are a couple. One is having real, meaningful consequences for state-sponsored doping. We saw this come about in the Sochi Olympics and how the Russian officials were involved in creating this system that allowed doping to occur. And the fallout from that has, in most people's estimations, been insufficient, or the consequences for that have been insufficient. And so I think the rules really need to address these types of situations in a more meaningful way, so that the consequences can apply to those who are actually responsible, including organizations, organizational leaders, athlete support persons. So that's why I'm excited about the Rodchenkov Anti-Doping Act, because in some way this fills that gap. But I think there's more work to be done within the anti-doping space to ensure that something like that never happens again. The other challenge that I would note, I referred to it earlier, but it's the inadvertent ingestion of a prohibited substance that results in a positive test. We just need to do more to ensure that innocent contamination from food or medication is not a violation and does not cause the stress and anguish that being accused of a violation causes. And so the more we can do on the front end or within the rules to eliminate inadvertent positive tests from resulting in violations, the better.
Certainly. And I know when you've got these big challenges, oftentimes resources are a limiting factor in being able to address them. So, Jeff, if we gave you all of the resources imaginable, anything you could dream up today, what is the one problem in anti-doping that you would want to start with solving first?
Well, I think, of course, some of the things that I just mentioned can certainly be addressed through more funding and through scientific grants and papers and research to ensure that these contamination issues are really minimized further. Other than that, I think the biggest impact additional resources could have would be with respect to technology. USADA has been on the forefront of innovations in this space for many years, but the rest of the world should be at the same level, and we should really be providing athletes with services that are easy to use and as limited in terms of the intrusiveness as possible, while still ensuring that the anti-doping aims are met. So, for example, whereabouts. Whereabouts are probably the biggest burden on athletes to complete. And there are technology solutions available or that can be developed to make that process much easier and less burdensome, while still providing or maybe even improving an anti-doping organization's ability to test an athlete anytime and any place, which is what's required under the rules. And that's the goal. And that's what's necessary to have the effective deterrent. So that's probably the area that I see where resources can have the biggest and most immediate impact.
Definitely. So can you describe maybe in a little bit more detail some of the technological measures that USADA has taken that you would like to see others adopt when it comes to whereabouts or other aspects of anti-doping?
Certainly, and this will go back a few years because USADA has been doing it for a while, and there are fairly recently developments that I think are becoming available internationally. So, for example, we have a paperless sample collection process where all of the information is stored on an iPad and is transferred electronically to the labs and back to USADA, all the necessary information. And so that's an example of where there's been a technological advancement that really improves the process and makes it easier for all those involved. And then we have an app that allows athletes to update their whereabouts as opposed to maybe having to log in to a site and going through a number of steps to do so. So things like that just make the experience more seamless and more user-friendly.
Oh, very cool. Well, I know we've covered a lot of ground today, Jeff. We've talked about a diverse set of topics. If listeners want to learn more, where should they go?
The best place to go is our website, USADA.org. And if you click on the athletes tab, you'll see a ton of information that's available, including about results management, which is what the legal department calls, essentially referring to cases resulting from tests or other evidence. So anything related to the legal department can be found under that results management heading, but you can also see all of the different departments and information that we have just right there on our website. So I'd highly recommend going there and looking through these different resources.
Fantastic. Well, listeners, check out that website, learn more about what's going on at USADA and some of the great work that Jeff is doing there. And Jeff, it's been a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
Wonderful to have you here. Listeners, great to have you here as well. If you haven't already, we would truly appreciate it if you could leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform to let everyone know what you think of the show. And we hope you'll join us on our next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.